While consoles are getting more expensive and the technological leaps are definitely vast, the tangible result can be somewhat hard to see. Visuals have gotten so good that they're somewhat taken for granted. Like yes, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart looks outstanding, but so did the PlayStation 4 game. The biggest games of this generation are games that also run on the previous generation, with a few exceptions. Games like Spider-Man 2 are definitely pushing some boundaries with SSD tech, and over on the PC side, some games are using ray tracing and path tracing to completely evolve lighting. But for the majority of commercial products, there hasn't really been a big leap, and this is to be expected. I recently conducted a Twitter poll asking which generation had the most impressive technological leap from the previous one, and it looked a bit like this. There were almost 11,000 votes, and 42% went for the jump to 3D, being the PlayStation, the N64, and the Sega Saturn. However, just below that, 39.6% went for PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and Dreamcast, which is extremely close to the prior group, and then it's just a big drop-off. Now, what I find very interesting about this is the second group, because the first one is pretty obvious. I mean, we're going from 2D planes to full-on 3D environments. Games like Mario, which were just about going left and right in a very linear fashion, became a sandbox where you can go anywhere. Games like Zelda, which were already trying to push the boundaries of exploration, suddenly just burst open into a massive open field. And while the N64 was very impressive from a graphical perspective, the PlayStation was pushing so many boundaries. We had games like Metal Gear Solid with full-on voice acting. It changed the medium. Games were no longer just things that you could play, they became things you could experience. Stories could be told in a much more tangible way. Final Fantasy VII was huge. It was unlike anything we'd seen before. You had this beautiful CD quality audio, all these outstanding pre-rendered backgrounds, and it all just became a world that could not have been done on previous consoles. And genres like survival horror really found themselves on the PlayStation. Resident Evil and Silent Hill and Parasite Eve and so many more were actually scary on the PlayStation. Racing games like Ridge Racer and Gran Turismo were no longer battling with their perception and suddenly were really easy to play, and in some cases, like Gran Turismo, visually incredible. And the Sega Saturn was no slouch either, with really visually impressive games like Panzer Dragoon, Virtua Fighter 2, and Sonic World and Sonic Jam. I love this aesthetic. So this entire generation was obviously a huge leap from 16-bit. So many video game genres were reimagined and in some cases created in this field. So why is the next generation so darn close? Well, let's do a few comparisons. With Metal Gear Solid, we went from this to this in Metal Gear Solid 2 on the PlayStation 2 to this in Metal Gear Solid 3 on the PlayStation 3. Each of them has a very big, tangible jump, but it will never quite be as big as this to this. Metal Gear Solid 2 took blocky figures that nodded their heads and just bobbed along with the voice track and made them actually look human. Metal Gear Solid 2 does all of this while also running at 60 frames per second for the entire game. We've got all these weather effects and cloth physics. Everything just comes together to form a game that we couldn't have had on the PlayStation 1. Even if you downgraded the game to the point where it looked like a 32-bit game, this would not have been possible. And in this generation, dual sticks also became a standard. The PS1 did have a DualShock, but it was introduced in the middle of the life cycle. Whereas in this generation, with PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, every game was built around these controllers. And our little buddy Dreamcast was just kind of doing his own thing. But for its time, Dreamcast was even more impressive, beating PS2 to market by 2 years. We went from 32-bit games which were blocky to 64-bit games which were more visually impressive but compromised by the nature of cartridges, to this. We could finally play premier 3D arcade games like Soul Calibur at home. And while Sega Saturn, PS1, and N64 struggled with performance with games like Ocarina of Time running at a very low frame rate, Dreamcast was home to so many 60 frames per second games while looking substantially better. Power Stone, Crazy Taxi, Soul Calibur, Sonic Adventure 2. This was such a leap from previous consoles. But it wasn't just visuals and performance. The Dreamcast could also connect to the internet, allowing online play in 1998. This included MMOs like Phantasy Star Online and DLC for games like Sonic Adventure. Dreamcast was absolutely the start of this generation, and it kicked it off on a very, very high note. Anyone, regardless of their experience with games, can tell you that this is a big jump from this. In fact, developers were remaking games that were only a few years old, and the jump is staggering. There's only 6 years between Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil Remake. If that were to happen in the modern era, people would be extremely upset, but the results speak for themselves. The jump in quality is so huge. We will never have another jump that looks like this. The quality of both what can be displayed pre-rendered and rendered is just so big. Then we've got other remakes like Tomb Raider to Tomb Raider Anniversary, Metal Gear Solid to Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes, and just general franchise jumps like Tekken 1 to Tekken 5. Look at this! Time Splitters is also really interesting, as it's created by ex-GoldenEye developers, and you can tell just by the sound effects and the general look of the game. But unlike GoldenEye, which could barely hold a stable frame rate, Time Splitters is 60 frames per second. While both are definitely great games, it definitely shows you the performance leap between the two systems. PS2 had so many games that were previously impossible. Shadow of the Colossus, Eco, Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3, Metal Gear Solid 2, Metal Gear Solid 3, Persona 3, Persona 4, Gran Turismo 3, and of course, Grand Theft Auto. This originally started on the PlayStation 1 with GTA 1 and 2, which were top-down bird's-eye view games, and they suddenly became third-person open-world chaos. The core themes remained, but this absolutely changed video games. This is one of the biggest genre leaps of all time, and they did 3 of these in that generation, with GTA 3, Vice City, and then San Andreas, and then also Vice City Stories and Liberty City Stories. In fact, the PS2 very often just redefined the game and then did it as a whole trilogy, like Ratchet & Clank, which had a saga, Jak and Daxter, which had a trilogy, Sly Cooper, which had a trilogy. The whole system was off its rocker. And GameCube likewise. F-Zero X was already very impressive, a 60 frames per second high-speed 3D racer on the N64. But F-Zero GX is not only far more detailed, but also so much faster. And speaking of the few 60 FPS N64 games, Super Smash Bros. You can tell that this one was only just possible. Characters were built out of just a few little blocks, but only a couple of years later, and we're talking like 2 years, came Super Smash Bros. Melee, and look at this. That is a gob-smacking jump. And then of course the Xbox was even more impressive with games like Halo 2, which looked like nothing we'd ever seen before, especially on console. In fact, the jump between Halo 2 and Halo 3, while pretty substantial from a color perspective, really isn't that astronomical. With games made around dual analog sticks and online play and visuals that still look good today, and many 60 frames per second games, and games pioneering genres like GTA and Resident Evil 4, many games from this era still feel incredibly modern. In fact, we've barely evolved beyond them. One of the best video games of 2023 is Metroid Prime Remastered, and that barely touches the game itself. It is just a visual makeover. It still runs at 60 FPS, just like the GameCube game, and there are some control adjustments, but for the most part, these are the same game. Star Fox Adventures still has better looking fur than many modern games. And the leap between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess? How do you even describe this? The only thing that wasn't a huge jump was resolution. Most games in the previous generation hit around 240p, whereas on the PS2, 360p and 480i or 480p were more of a standard. Now don't get me wrong, considering the displays of the time, that made perfect sense. These games may look a bit jaggedy and maybe even blurry on big 4K displays, but on a CRT of the time, they still look fantastic. We even had some games in this era embracing 16:9 widescreen, and on Xbox, even some of them had 720p and 1080i support. But with the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, HD TVs were becoming a lot more common, and so the resolution jump was pretty massive. Now, in this generation, most games ran around 720p. There were some 1080p games, but 720p was more of a standard. But still, going from 480 to 720 is the biggest resolution jump so far. There's definitely a very noticeable, tangible jump between this generation and the next one, so I can understand why 14.3% of people chose this era, especially as online, while possible on previous systems, became much more prominent here. Games like Uncharted 2, Gears of War, and The Last of Us really pushed the boundaries of what's possible in this generation. And you know, the jump to PS4 was also somewhat tangible, especially in regards to performance, as 360 and PS3 kinda struggle through that entire generation. But going from this to this is definitely not like going from this to this. This is all to say that I think I agree with the 39.6%. Yes, going from sprite-based 2D games to full-on 3D was very impressive, it pushed the industry forward, and it was mind-blowing for the time. But the refinement of 3D, I think, is even more impressive. It was such a big boost in clarity and made so many other games possible, and I think the most important part is going back to play them today. I think many PS1 games have aged very well, but of course, for some of them you've got to get back into the mindset. But with PlayStation 2, with so many of them, you can just jump on back in. In fact, there are so many PlayStation 2 remasters still being sold today, barely touching any of their gameplay, because the gameplay is still so modern. Although, another jump that's very impressive is Game Boy Advance to PlayStation Portable. Going by Japanese release dates, these were only 3 years apart. And God, look at the difference. This is like going from just above Super Nintendo to almost PlayStation 2. This may actually be the most impressive graphical jump. And what's kinda cool is we should probably expect something fairly similar with the next Nintendo system. Nintendo have been marching to the beat of their own drum for a while. I mean, the Wii was basically a continuation of the GameCube, and then the Wii U came along just prior to the PlayStation 4 and acted more like a 360. And then the Switch was basically a bit more powerful than the Wii U, so it was more or less a more souped-up 360. So for around a decade now, they've been working with very similar tech. And with the next system, there is suddenly going to be a near 10-year jump in graphical fidelity. Now, this video isn't to disparage where we are now. I think PlayStation 5 and Series X are still finding themselves 3 years in, and I am definitely impressed by what some games are achieving visually. It's just, I never think we're gonna have that moment where it's like, whoa, this is where video games are now, because we're just so used to what we have that it's kind of becoming normalized. Whereas going from PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2, or N64 to GameCube, was something that will simply never be experienced again.